Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Visual Studio Toolbox, Extensibility Edition. I'm your host, Leslie Richardson, and today we are continuing with part 2 of our extensibility journey with the new extensions model, VisualStudio.Extensibility. So last time we talked a little bit about just what VisualStudio.Extensibility is and why we started creating the model. And this time around, because we're starting from scratch with this new model, let's also take some time to start from scratch on our knowledge and understanding of what an extension in Visual Studio even is. So joining me today to talk about just what even is an extension as it relates to Visual Studio is Maia. Welcome, Maia.
Hi, Leslie. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for being here. So can you give us a quick intro to yourself before we dive on in?
Sure. So as Leslie mentioned, my name is Maia, and I am a developer on the Visual Studio Extensibility team. And I've been working on the new extensibility model for about a year, and I am very, very excited to share it with everyone.
Awesome. So with the new extensibility model that we're doing, we have a goal of trying to make it a lot more accessible for people who are new to developing and new to writing extensions. So I think there's going to be a lot of people out there who need just a precursor to what an extension even is and what are the different common components that people will be working with in this new model. So I think we should give them a quick glossary notes of what everything is.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad we're doing this because as Leslie mentioned, one of the main things that we're trying to do with this new extensibility model is make it so much easier for people who were intimidated or never even thought to give extension development a try in the past, give them a reason to take a second look and get involved. And so I think what we want to do with this talk is cover just some of the foundational topics that'll make it easier for those folks to kind of get their feet wet and understand what are some of the possibilities for things you could do with extensions. So in the next few slides, I've called out several of the most common, but just to give you a sense for if you were to write an extension, what are some of the things that you could either do with it or to put it in a different way, what are parts of the IDE that you could extend? So here are 3 of the absolute most common. Leslie, I'm not sure how you want to do this. I can go through them, or if you want to kind of call them off individually, how would you like to do it?
Go on through and I will stop you when I feel like it. No, I'm just
Okay,
kidding.
perfect.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, I would say far and away the most common thing that you interact with in the Visual Studio IDE other than text documents is probably going to be commands. So commands are things in the menus or toolbars. There are a whole lot of built-in commands that people will be familiar with, things like save, save all. I have a few other examples here, comment, block, insert, quit. And basically they're a way to trigger an action or execute some functionality. So a lot of your extensions are going to involve adding commands to execute your own functionality. The second thing you might want to do is to create a tool window. So a little bit later in this presentation, I have some examples of some built-in tool windows. But tool windows are one of the primary ways that we display content to users in the Visual Studio IDE and let them sort of interact with things either in the project system or the tests or a handful of other things. Almost everything that is not a document in the editor is going to be in a tool window, and so we'll talk about those. And finally, as I mentioned, far and away, the most common thing you might want to interact with is probably going to be the editor. So we say editor, that's sort of a Visual Studio specific term for working with files, documents, and text. So anytime you say, I want to do something when a file is opened, or I want to modify the text in a file, I want to format a document, that's going to involve working with the editor. So before I move on to the next group of 3 things, anything you want to jump in on here?
No, I think that was very self-explanatory. I think commands are definitely a huge foundation / building block for most applications or most extensions that you're writing. And the good news about all 3 of these is that we're going to have deep dive videos for all 3 of these. So if you're following along in the playlist, definitely check out those specific episodes to learn more about each of those different topics.
Yeah, that's perfect. It's almost like we planned it that way.
I know, right? What a coincidence.
The one thing I do want to mention that I just thought of before we got into the next slide, when I was getting started with extension development, I had a kind of question for myself of like, okay, well, you told me I can write an extension. What can I do? As I said, we want to answer that question, but these things are actually usually going to be stitched together. So you might want to do something in the editor and you'll write a command to trigger that. Or you might want to create a tool window and you'll write a command to launch that tool window. So even though we're going to talk about these like they're separate things, in many cases, you're going to kind of put them together to make a valuable extension. So just wanted to call that out.
Awesome. Good point.
As we jump on to the next slide, this slide is sort of about how you can interact with users, how you can communicate information to them or get information back. So currently we have three main ways that you can communicate with the user. You can show a user prompt. And so in most cases, that's going to look like a message box that pops up with your message. And optionally, you can have buttons requesting a response, either an OK, cancel, or a handful of other options. If you have a long-running operation and you want to show the user the progress of that operation, we have a progress reporter, which lets you do that in a slick built-in way. And then one of the main ways that you're going to communicate with the user is through the output window. So many of you will have seen it in Visual Studio, whether or not you knew it was called the output window. I have a screenshot later, which we'll see, but that's kind of a long-running log of messages occurring in Visual Studio that are of interest to the user. So writing there is a great way to communicate some status to the user. Anything here?
Nope. Once again, you're on a roll. Very self-explanatory. Yeah,
Okay.
the output window has so much going on with it that you could possibly extend. I know one of my favorite extensions is just making things colored because there's so much
Honestly,
wording. Yeah, sometimes you
really
just need
useful.
color labels. So
Yeah, and that's a great point because a lot of these things I've talked about a lot of things where you can kind of add UI elements, but there are also things you can do, like Leslie just pointed out, where you can modify existing UI elements to change the color, change the appearance, or make them more useful. So that's a great point. Kind of next, what I thought we'd do, we talked about some of the main things you might do with your extension. I just kind of wanted to talk through, we say extension, what is it? How does it live on disk and out in the world, and how can people install and use it? So an extension is going to start its life on, your machine, the extender, and you'll write it and you'll test it, and we have, a whole debugging workflow for doing that. Once you feel like you've got it to a place where it's ready to be shared, you're going to package it up, and it gets packaged into an extension file, a .vsix v6 extension. And then you can either just share that v6 file, or eventually you'll be able to upload that to the Visual Studio Marketplace. And regardless of which way you do it, your users, the end users of Visual Studio, can then install it and use it on their copy of Visual Studio. And so that's kind of how you're able to get this out there.
yep, good stuff. Easy as 1, 2, 3.
Yeah,
Wish we
easy as
had
1, 2, 3.
numbers to the top, but yeah.
Oh yeah, we definitely should. So if you're ready to do it, I thought we might drill into each of those items that we mentioned before, at least a handful of them, just to give a little bit of extra context.
Cool, yeah, sounds good.
So we mentioned commands. I just wanted to kind of show here what they look like in the UI, because it's the same terminology, command, regardless of whether you put it in a menu, as we have on the left with the insert GUID command, or in the toolbar, as we have on the right with the uncomment command. And you're certainly welcome to have the same command live in both the menu and the toolbar, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the scope for kind of where you can place these. Not shown here, but also, optional in certain more advanced scenarios, you can execute a command programmatically. So other parts of your extension can call a command sort of without the UI, but these are the main ways that it's going to live in the UI.
Cool. Yeah, so I mean, pretty much every action that we see in Visual Studio in a lot of ways could count as a command of some sort. Yep.
Yeah, almost everything that's not going to be either sort of in a document that you're editing or in one of the tool windows, which we'll see next, is going to be a command. So they're really the bedrock of a lot of extensions that you'll write. And since I mentioned it, tool windows are going to be one of the primary ways that you show UI. So, if you want to show any UI content, maybe you want to wrap a UI around your web service that you connect to, or really any other kind of UI you want to show, you're going to do it in a tool window. So I have some examples of some of the built-in tool windows in Visual Studio, because I think a lot of you all watching will have seen these, and you may not have known that we call them tool windows, but they give you some examples of some of the things that you can do with them. So the first one I want to call out is the Solution Explorer. I think most users of Visual Studio will have seen this, and this is the tool window for the project system. And so it's a way for the project system to show the solutions or the projects that are open and kind of the files inside them. The next one is the output window, which I mentioned a few slides ago. I think most people will have seen this. This is where you can write messages to kind of an ongoing log. So what you see here on the top there, it says show output from, and there's a drop-down menu. This is showing output from the build system. But in that drop-down menu, if you create your own output window channel, you can create your own item in that drop-down menu and then show your own messages. And that'll be docked nicely in there. The third one that people may have seen is the Test Explorer. So the main reason I threw this one in here is it's a good example of how, in addition to the content that you might want to show within the tool window, you could also have, a family of buttons or other ways for the user to interact. So it's not just consuming content, it's also a place for interactivity. So these are three of the built-in ones that I wanted to show. But of course, if you're writing an extension, you can add your own tool windows, you can create your own content, and it will work just like these. The only last thing I wanted to say about this is if you look at both the Solution Explorer and the Output window screenshots I have there, you can see there are a number of other tool windows that are docked in the same location, and they show up as different tabs. So when you create a tool window, you can kind of move it all around and dock it in the UI, just like these. So editor is, I think, one of the most powerful parts we have to our extensibility model. Certainly, you're in Visual Studio to write code. Yes, it can do a handful of other things, but that's the bread and butter, is to write documents. And so because of that, a lot of the functionality that users might want to put in their extensions is going to be modifying the editor experience, because I think in a lot of cases it's developers themselves who come up with ideas for extensions based on their own development, who want to create extensions, and so that's going to be in the editor. So as I mentioned before, even though we call it the editor, when you hear editor, think files, documents, text. It's really anything that you want to edit or modify that exists as a document, it's going to be in the editor. And I just wanted to call out a few of the concepts in the editor. One is the document well. So that's this UI element that we have here. I think most users just think of it as the document. We think of it as a place where you can host other documents. You can see up top in my screenshot, there are a couple of different tabs hosted here. That's sort of the UI version. Now, behind the scenes, or sort of under the hood, whichever metaphor you prefer, there are a couple of concepts that map to a text document. So first, the first object I want to talk about is the text view. That is an in-code object that corresponds to the visual representation of the document that you see here in the document well. The other one is the text document, and that actually corresponds to the real contents, the actual bytes in the document on disk. So depending on what you're doing with the document, you might have to work with either or both. But I wanted to call them out here so people understood what each of them was, and that you might have to work with both of them. So this can be a tricky space, but that's because it's one of the most powerful.
I appreciate this particular clarification for the editor, because it's easy to conflate the editor, especially I think with a lot of different things. I mean, when I think editor, my mind goes to like the whole Word document kind of space, which is not always true in the Visual Studio context. So having differentiations between like text view and text document, which pop up very regularly if you're working on an editor-based extension, is good to know.
And I think one thing I want to call out throughout here is we're working really, really hard as a team to make sure that the whole extensibility API, not just the editor part, is as simple as it can be And I think one of our design principles is it should be no more complicated than it absolutely has to be, given the power that we're trying to um, expose. And so because the editor can do so much, there is some necessary complication. And that's why, for example, we have the text view versus the text document. But to our users, I promise we're taking it very seriously to try to limit that complexity. And because we've factored it this way, you can do some things pretty simply. So we're going to try to give you some ease of use in exchange for those extra concepts.
Yeah, I also want to give a shout out to Maia for forming those recurring API review meetings that our team has on a regular basis. Seriously, a lot of the issues that we have with like naming and conventions and making sure everything is as simplistic as it could be happens in those 2-hour sessions. So awesome job putting that together.
Thank you so much. They're a lot of time, but they're great. Growing up, I never thought I would have a passion for great API design, but here we are. I really feel passionate about this. So I'm glad that it's working out so well. If you take all of the kind of UI stuff that we talked about before, the tool windows, the document well in the editor, the menus and the toolbars, kind of collectively, those comprise the shell, which is just sort of the overall graphical user interface for the IDE. So throughout the API, you're going to see references to the shell. And almost any time you need to interact with the UI, whether you want to present something or get some information, you're going to be going through the shell. So I just wanted to call that out as one of the concepts you might see in the API. Next, I did want to call out, so as I mentioned before to Leslie, we work really hard to make sure that the API is as simple and intuitive for you to pick up and run with as it can be. And we really fight against unnecessary complexity. But there are a few conceptual prerequisites where if you have some background knowledge in them, it's really going to help you go further with your extension development. So one of the things that you're going to see in the upcoming demos is we worked really hard to make it so that extensions could run out of the main process for the IDE. So there are a lot of benefits to that, and some of the main ones are perf. This prevents your extension from causing the IDE to hang or crash or things like that. In general, it just sort of protects the user experience. But because it's out of process, there is some additional complexity that you, the extender, need to reason about to understand how your extension code is going to run. So I'd sort of recommend just doing, a little bit of background research into understanding cross-process execution. And especially because things are cross-process, you're going to have a lot of async programming, things that you're not necessarily going to want to block on a cross-process operation. So a lot of our extension model is going to be async. And we found that when new users come into this model and they haven't had any experience with async programming, they can sometimes find that to be an obstacle. So I'd recommend kind of doing a little bit of research on .NET async programming ahead of time. And then a lot of the stuff in our model will make a lot more sense. And finally, to simplify the creation of some of the objects in our library, we use dependency injection. And so that lets you kind of put things in the constructors for certain types in our model without necessarily going through all of the boilerplate to define them. So I would recommend just doing a little bit of familiarizing yourself with dependency injection, because I think that will also help make the model make a little more sense. Besides these three, Leslie, can you think of any kind of conceptual prerequisites?
No, I think that kind of sums up the bulk of things that I can think of off the top of my head. But, as people who have access to us, and if you go to the VS Extensibility repo, you can leave issues there if you feel like we're not explaining another concept that maybe we left out on this list that maybe should be either explained, or we can help provide documentations and resources for it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I really want to echo that. Like, the weight of our organization is standing behind this platform, and so please take advantage of the homepage for our extensibility model to not only report issues with the product itself, but also the documentation. If there's a whole topic that you feel we could explain better or that we're not explaining at all, we really want to make that documentation suitable for new users. So please listen to Leslie and go ahead and use the repo for that.
Yeah. And really, other than that, that's all you need to get started, except, yeah, how do we go about approaching extending? Because it is a bit of a different space from the usual development and applications and stuff that a lot of people do.
I think it really is worth calling out, because in some ways, the development is going to be exactly the same. So I've called this thinking like an extender, because you're still going to have users and you still care about their experience, and you still care about exposing certain features to them. But some of the things that are going to be different when you are extending an additional, when you're extending an existing product, and especially one like Visual Studio, is your customers, your users, are going to be developers themselves developing products at the same time. So it's a little bit of inception, but it sort of causes you to have to think about things a little bit differently than you might usually. So some things that I think you're probably used to thinking about are, how do I want to communicate or interact with my users? How do I want the UI to look? That's familiar development. But then you get into things like, okay, how do I want to place my UI within the existing IDE? Or how do I want to extend or change the existing UI for the IDE? That's a little bit different, thinking like an extender. Then, because it's Visual Studio and you're in the context of somebody's development lifecycle, you have a few questions even beyond that. So, for example, maybe you only want your command to show up in the menu when a solution is loaded. If your command is working on the project system and it requires a solution to be loaded, it doesn't even make sense to show your command if there's no solution that has been loaded. So that's like another kind of thing you have to start thinking about. What do you want to be true about the state of the IDE in order for your components to be enabled or visible? And those are a little bit different, because sometimes you want them to be enabled and usable programmatically in the background, but not necessarily visible to the user. Another great example of the thing you might want to do is, only activate my extension when the user opens a C# file. If they're working with C++ and your thing does some kind of .NET C# linting, then there's no need to run it on a C++ file. So these are just some examples of the kind of questions you need to start thinking about if you want to think like an extender, and in particular an extender for Visual Studio, because it just is a little bit different.
Yep. I think all of that makes great sense. And, on a more intimate level, just put yourself in the developer's shoes. Like, if you're writing an extension, it's probably because you most likely recognized a frustration that you yourself are experiencing while in Visual Studio. Like, if you're upset that there is too much going on in the output window and none of it is labeled by color, then, as you're developing your extension, think of it from that perspective. Like, what would you personally like to see in that extension, and how can you make that happen?
Yeah, I could not agree more. That's why I joined this team, because I used Visual Studio every day and I enjoyed it. And I was constantly thinking about, changes I might like or extensions I might add. And I thought, well, why not go do that professionally, so to speak? So that is exactly the right way to think about it. And if we've managed to get you excited about writing extensions, I encourage you to go to our homepage at aka.ms/VisualStudio.Extensibility.
Yep. And that will essentially redirect you to the VS Extensibility repo that we've been referring to. But all of that will be in the description below. And check that out for code samples, documentation, just all the tips and tricks that you need to get started with your own extensions, now that you know what a Visual Studio extension is.
Yeah.
So Maia, thank you so much for sharing that lightning round of topics that I think a lot of people would need to know to get started.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me. I really hope that we've managed to stoke some interest and get some people excited about writing extensions. And I can't wait to see what people come up with.
Yeah, same. So if you're excited to get started, definitely tune in for our next episode, where Bertan returns from the first episode to share how to write that building block of most of your extensions, commands. So until then, happy coding.